Welcome on behalf of Lee Summit Cares to Positive Parenting Practices. Today, our topic is Win or Lose, How Parents Can Help Create Champions for Life. Before I continue, I want to share a little bit about Lee Summit Cares. Lee Summit Cares mobilizes community partners to develop a culture of physical and mental wellness for Lee Summit youth and families that inspires positive, healthy choices. My name is Carrie Gray, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist who facilitates webinars for Lee Summit Cares on many parenting topics on behalf of Rediscover Mental Health. And so today, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about how essentially we can use sports and other extracurricular activities as a way of making and creating and cultivating champions for life. And so specifically, this slide shares what we're going to jump into. We're going to discuss the benefits of youth involvement in extracurricular activities. You get to consider statistics related to the cost of youth sports and outcomes, research on top 5 reasons why youth quit, learn how to develop champions for life by focusing on the process rather than the outcome, and learn how to avoid common parenting mistakes that harm motivation and performance. So we have a lot of information to cover today. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is why we might include our kids in extracurricular activities. For many people, when we ask this question, parents often say, well, I want my kid to get out there and socialize with other kids. I want to introduce them to different activities. I want to keep them active. Typically, people aren't saying, I want to put my kids in extracurricular activities because I want to get up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning. That's typically not the motivation in doing so, yet oftentimes it can develop into that just because of how activities are structured today. So let's take a look at some of the benefits in involving your kids in extracurricular activities. We know a huge benefit is to their character development. In life, successful people are good at accepting constructive criticism. And that is a process that we learn over time. And so for a child to get used to accepting feedback and to be able to use that feedback as a teaching tool when they're young is something that they can continue to take with them as they continue into their adult years. Another benefit is reinforcing new skills. And so perhaps you might be thinking of a skill in terms of a gymnast learning how to do, a certain stunt or to perform on an apparatus. But we also know that our kids are also developing thinking, problem solving skills, and of course, time management. Because they need to learn over time how to balance the responsibilities they have to their schoolwork as well as to their home and their community with the responsibility of being involved in that extracurricular activity, being on time for practices, etc. We also know through different forms of research studies that kids who participate in extracurricular activities tend to have better academic performance. So they do better in areas such as math and science and reading. And overall, they have a better attitude towards school, which of course is going to influence their motivation. We noticed improved social skills, learning how to lead, to work together as a team. Certainly, there will be conflict that comes up throughout the process, especially with team sports. And so learning how to resolve those conflicts in a respectful way, but also creating connections with other peers who have similar interests. And we know that relationships are an important part of our life. Other things that kids get are discipline by having to do drills, for example, practicing, having routines that need to take place on a regular basis in order to get better. Certainly, we develop self-confidence and resiliency as kids experience some of the setbacks that come in participating in any activity, whether that setback is maybe not getting that particular time that the child was aiming for, or that place, win or lose. Certainly different obstacles that many overcome have to do with injuries, things like that. So learning how to overcome different challenges and disappointments is a key way to develop confidence and resiliency for life. And then there's two others, and I'm sure there's many more benefits for engaging your kids in sports. But the other two mentioned here are learning a respect for authority. So that in addition to sharing respect, obviously, to parents, guardians, older people within their life, also showing that respect to a coach or another person who's working with them to develop. And finally, learning the fundamentals of sportsmanship. How do we win or lose with grace? How do we play with integrity, with fairness, in a respectful way? These are all key things that we oftentimes don't think about when we're signing our kids up to participate in activities, but there are some great underlying benefits here that will certainly aid our kids in life. And so this next slide talks a little bit about perspective. And so sometimes parents talk about, involving their kids in certain activities and seeing that they have some pretty good potential and thinking, wow, perhaps this kid could earn some kind of funding or scholarship to help with college. Which we all know college is tremendously expensive, and finding ways to reduce the cost is at the top of our minds for many of us. And so, but if we look at that and put that thought in perspective, what we find in the statistics is that 2% of athletes, high school athletes, are awarded college scholarships. So when you think of the hundreds and thousands of kids that participate in high school sports, such a small percentage actually goes on to be awarded in college scholarships of some kind. We also know that $957 is the average pay per youth athlete, and this was back in 2018. And so the cost of involving our kids in youth sports, it's not cheap. It's expensive, and so it can take a toll on our finances, how we invest and spend our money. We also know that less than 1% of athletes go on to play professionally. And we need to keep in mind that 17 billion is the amount that the youth sports industry brings in annually. And so to put that in perspective, the youth sports industry is larger than professional baseball and about the same size as the NFL. And so a lot of money is going into youth sports, and a lot of people are profiting off of youth sports. And finally, one other sobering statistic here is that 80% of student athletes age 15 decide to quit. And there's various reasons why they decide to quit, and we'll be getting into that as we go further into the webinar. But this is important in terms of keeping perspective on, uh, what the outcomes might be in terms of financial support down the road in how you choose to involve your kids in different forms of youth sports. Now, I mentioned the last statistic was why youth quit. And so this was a study that was conducted through the Changing the Game project. And what they found through their project was that 70% of kids quit because it's no longer fun. And so it's important that kids are excited to get out there, that they're looking forward to competing. They're in an environment where they feel respected, that they're a valued part of the team. Otherwise, it's just not that fun anymore, and they don't want to participate. Another reason is a sense of lost ownership of the experience. And this could be due to constant scrutiny. And so essentially, that might be where a coach or a parent is constantly criticizing and trying to redirect that child in their game play. And that gets problematic when we look at what kids really want from their parents and how parents can best support them from their point of view in youth sports. It is not to be another coach, but rather just to enjoy watching them play the game. Third highest reason is they don't get playing time. And so when asked, 90% of youth would rather play on a losing team than sit the bench. And so what does that mean? That, they are engaged in that sport because they want to participate in that sport. They want to challenge themselves. They want to get better. They want to get out there and have fun. A fourth reason is because they are afraid to make mistakes. And so we have to be very careful of the expectations that we're setting, and allowing our kids to learn and make mistakes and not imposing that they need to be perfect in the play. And then the final one is the reason is that they might feel disrespected. And I have 4 children. They've participated in many sports as they were growing up. And one example of feeling disrespected is simply how a coach communicates with the kids. Are they speaking to the kid in a disrespectful way or in an empowering way? How does the coach deal with disappointment? How does the coach motivate, the child to perform well? And we find that there's things that work well and things that don't work well at all. So on the second side of the slide, it focuses on what youth want from their parents. And so if we recognize that the number one reason why kids quit activities is because it's no longer fun, then it makes sense that we continue to find ways for them to enjoy the game and to check in with them and make sure, are you still having fun doing this, or is it a chore? What needs to change in order to bring the fun back into the game? An example that I put here on the screen is with Michael Jordan, the professional basketball player for the Chicago Bulls. He always had a love the game in his contract, professional contracts that he signed each year, which was essentially a clause that said that he was allowed to play pickup basketball games at any time. And that's what kept him loving the game, was not being ruled by the NBA, but being able to still participate in those games when opportunities presented themselves. Another thing that we can do to help our kids is to help them find their passion instead of finding it for them. And so giving them opportunities to experiment and try out different forms of activities and to have some decision-making power in terms of whether or not they want to stick with that particular activity. I think one of the hardest things for parents, and I experienced this myself, is when a child shows really good proficiency in a particular area, but yet it's not something that they enjoy. And so forcing a child to do something that they're incredibly good at, but they don't love, creates problems. And over time, because they're not being motivated by that internal drive, we find that the kids lose interest in that activity. And so being willing to let them change their mind, to choose things that are a passion to them, giving them permission to step away from things, to take breaks from times, is also another thing that will help to build that internal motivation. Allowing kids to develop at their own pace. And so, just letting them, again, going back to enjoying the game, not pushing them too hard. It's finding a balance, and we don't want to push them beyond what their ability is, because that will result in them feeling a sense of disappointment. It harms their self-confidence, but rather just focusing on enjoying the game and the things that they're learning and progressing and getting better at as they continue to practice. We also want to encourage risk taking. When our kids mess up, or let's say they don't win a game, they need to learn how to handle failure. Failure is a part of life. The most successful people in life have failed a great number of times before they became tremendously successful. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then finally, the golden rule: do unto others as you would want them to do to you. And so these are just some good thoughts to keep in mind as you think about why a child might quit an activity, and listening to feedback from them about what they need from you as a parent, what they want the most. And so the bottom line is shown in this picture, in this slide, that we care about the child. We show that we care about them as a whole human being. So it's not just about that sport or activity, but it's things beyond the sport and activity, their interests, just their personality, their friendships, other things going on in their life are equally as important. So some of the mistakes that we have to be very careful of as parents, and this came from a Team Snap editorial. As you can see, one of the mistakes that they say to watch out for is that we, the parent, take youth sports too seriously. All right. And so it's important that you remind yourself that the sport is not about you. It's about the kid and their experience with that sport or that activities. And so you might be someone who's taking it too seriously if you're taking the successes and failures personally, if your own self-concept is determined by how well your child performs. Those are some red flags to watch for in that area. Another one is that you constantly interfere. And so instead of interfering, it's important to empower your child or your teen or your young adult to talk with the coach about issues with playing time, position, etc. Your role would be to maybe even role play with the child in discussing their concerns with the coach. One of my daughters was empowered to do this after traveling for a soccer game to a different state, and she played the beginning of the first game and then hardly saw any playing time for the rest of the tournament. And of course, as parents, we were a little frustrated because of the amount of money that was spent to travel, and you want to see your kid out on the field. But what we decided to do was to use it as an opportunity to empower our daughter to talk to the coach, which essentially went like this, asking for a time that would be okay to talk for a few minutes after practice or before. And then she basically, shared what she would like to see happen, that she was frustrated that she didn't get much playing time during that tournament, and what are the things that she needed to do differently in order to increase her playing time. And so years later, we ran into the coach, and he said just how impressed he was with that. And because of that conversation, she then got some great feedback on things that she needed to be doing differently. And he also knew that she was very motivated to accept criticism and work on making the changes that she needed to make to get the playing time that she wanted. So that's another suggestion there. The next one is you don't bite your tongue enough. So we need to keep in mind that our words carry weight. And so in addition to, yelling at referees or whatnot during the game, avoid venting to our children about playing time, other players, other parents, things like that. Instead, it's better just to bite your tongue, focus on the game process and your own child's experience. And then there's two more here. The next one is you try too hard to motivate your child. And we're going to go into motivation a little bit deeper in a few slides here because it's so important. But we know that things that don't work well for motivating children is comparing them to someone else. That tends to make them feel less confident when we do that. And confident kids perform well. And so avoid comparisons, avoid bribing them with some external reward, or simply just pushing them to do too much. Every kid has their limits, and knowing what a balance is in terms of life balance between their schoolwork, between having some form of social life, which is equal, just as important, making contributions around the home. Our role as parents is to help our children to get balance in those areas. And sometimes when we're pushing our kids too far, they might act out differently, or we might start seeing some slides in their grades, an increase in agitation, just talking about feeling anxious or stressed out. And so we need to really moderate that pressure that we put on our kids and make sure that we have that right balance. And then finally, the last thing is you obsess about playing time, position, and statistics. And so instead of focusing on how much time your child has gotten to play, for example, focus on what your child learned through that particular game. How did they have fun while playing? How did they help another player if it was a team sport? What are they learning about themselves through this process? And so just some ideas to be thinking about as we look at even ways to motivate. Now, this question asks, what is the cost of being hyper-focused on winning? And because this was initially a live webinar, people were giving these opportunities. And essentially, when we focus too much on the outcomes, and I know outcomes are important, it has a tendency to take the joy out of the game. It can lower motivation, and it can even get talented athletes or performers to say, I don't care, I don't want to be a part of this because it's not any fun anymore. And it can create some real wedges in our relationships with our kids. And so it's important to keep in mind that if the need comes along down the road, we do want our kids to choose a good nursing home for us. And so relationship is important. And I do say that tongue in cheek, just to put a little humor here. but there's definitely some cost to focusing too much on just the win. So here are some examples of what you can do to help focus more on the process rather than the outcome. And so instead of saying, how many points did you get today? You might ask, what did you learn today? Did you get an A or a perfect score? Another question would be, did you figure out how to have fun while working hard? Did you win? Instead of did you win, did you help a teammate? Taking place of the coach and coaching the kid, we know is a problem. Asking a condescending question like, what were you thinking when you did that play in that certain way? All right. Or why do I bother coming to watch you? Those are very degrading statements that really take the fun out of the game and motivation out of the game and make a child not want to participate, because by doing those things and focusing in those areas, the child's self-worth becomes tied more to those outcomes rather than to the experience and the character and the things that they're learning through the experience. So the questions on the right side where it says do this, those are the questions that can be used to help us focus on the process. And so there's just a few more listed here that I didn't mention. One is, did you help a teammate today? And the final one is, I notice you didn't let a mistake overcome you. How did you do that? And so that's huge, especially, in lengthy, play, being able to bounce back, from making a mistake is huge. And being able to recover is very important. And so that shows some resilience. So how did the kid do that? Now, as we wrap up, we're just going to address a few things. And one of them is motivation, which is important to keep in mind. Motivation is the reason a person acts in particular ways. And essentially, there's two different types of motivation. One is intrinsic motivation, where you do an activity because you basically love it and it's interesting. You're passionate about it, you enjoy it, it's fun. And there's extrinsic motivation, which is for rewards or other incentives that drive the behavior. And so different types of motivation can be effective in different situations. But when we're looking within the context of motivating someone to optimal performance, we find that intrinsic motivation, meaning where it's coming from the inside of the person, is much more sustainable and produces much better outcomes than from trying to motivate someone from the outside in. There is a wonderful YouTube video of Patrick Mahomes, and it's headed mic'd up, and he's hyping up McCole Hardman after a fumble during the Chiefs-Bills AFC Championship game. If you get a moment, definitely take some time to Google that and look at how Patrick Mahomes as well as Travis Kelce speak to Hardman and essentially empower him to bounce back after making a mistake. They do a really good job of motivating him. And so these are some other ways in which to increase that intrinsic motivation. Research shows that when people engage in an activity out of intrinsic motivation, the quality of engagements and results are better. And so we can do this in the following ways. One example is by giving them a sense of agency, by allowing them to choose the activity, developing the appropriate level of competence, meaning we want to put our kid in a situation where it's not too hard, but it's not too easy. And so finding a nice balance there, giving the child a say in how he or she accomplishes a goal. And so how they address, their concerns with the coach, how much they practice outside of that activity, etc. Getting them to make some decisions about what he or she needs to do to get the outcome they want. Focusing in terms of growth mindset is really looking at when I make a mistake, and I will, what can I learn? How can I grow through this process? Teaching self-advocacy, meaning how do we empower our kids to talk to the coach about what they want, what they need, what their goals are, and how they can help your child to get there. And helping your child, there it is, develop a plan to reach their goal. These are all wonderful things that we know work in terms of increasing individual intrinsic motivation, whether that's dealing with kids or adults. These are all important things to keep in mind. And so that concludes this webinar on winning or losing, how we as parents can help our kids become champions for life. As you can see, that there's other webinars that have been recorded and that you can find at the Lee Summit Cares YouTube channel. And these webinars are recorded monthly, with the exception of during the summer months. So I hope you'll tune in to future webinars, and please do check the Lee Summit Cares website for information on upcoming opportunities.